If anyone else is here for the torture seminar, this is not it. This is Men and Masculinity.
Wait, this was on Friday. 8/17.
Oh, 8/17?
Yeah, that was on Friday.
No. There are 3 there. One was on Friday.
So we need to get started, don't we?
Okay.
Okay.
Well, it says right here the 17th for the torture seminar.
Oh.
Okay.
We're
going to get started.
Get started.
Unfortunately, Michael Addis, who was the chair for the symposium, was unable to attend, so he asked me to read his introductory remarks for the symposium, and I'll do that now. Hello, and welcome to our symposium on bringing psychology into the psychology of men and masculinity. My name is Michael Addis. For those of you who know me, you'll notice some remarkable transformations since last time we saw each other. First, I look a good 15 years younger. These collagen treatments are working wonders. And second, I'm now a woman. I thought this would be a major change, but to be honest, it's not really all that different. I keep walking into the wrong restroom and my shoes are too big, but other than that, things are pretty much status quo. But seriously, I have asked Alisha to read some brief introductory remarks, and we'll begin by introducing our speakers. First, MySha Whorley and Jason Berkowitz will be presenting a paper on basic emotion research as a framework for understanding emotional non-expression in men. Matt Syzdek and Jonathan Green will be presenting a paper on integrating basic psychopathology models and methods into the study of depression in men. Our discussant, Ron Levant, was unable to make it due to scheduling conflicts here at the conference. We hope to use whatever additional time we have for audience questions and discussion. The motivation for this symposium came from a series of conversations in our research group over the last year. Each week we met to discuss a range of research topics related to men and masculinity, including men and depression, help-seeking, emotional expression, approaches to intervention, and so on. 2 recurring themes emerged from our discussions. First, researchers and clinicians in the area of men and masculinity are tackling issues of great importance. Do men express depression differently than women? What are the mental and physical health consequences of restricted emotionality? What are the causes and consequences of anger and aggression in men? How can we develop and evaluate therapies that are maximally effective for men? The second theme that emerged was a recurrent observation that these lines of research and clinical work were typically not grounded in basic work in psychology. In other words, the psychology of men and masculinity has evolved in relative isolation from psychology more broadly. This is a bold claim, but one I believe is supported by the data. Consider, how much of our research on restricted emotionality in men is grounded in basic theoretical and empirical work on emotion? How much of our work on men and depression is linked to current psychopathology research on depression? How much of our work on the effects of masculine gender socialization is guided by current theory and research on social learning? I believe that if you read our journals carefully, you'll see that the answer is very little. How did this happen? At the risk of oversimplifying, let me suggest the following. First, following on the heels of feminist scholarship of the 60s and 70s, the psychology of men and masculinity began with a single, very powerful idea. Boys' and men's lives are shaped by the social construction and social learning of gender roles and norms. Masculinity came to be understood as the sum total consequences of all of this gendered learning. Clearly, men and boys differed in the degree to which they were affected by traditional masculine gender norms. It made sense then, early on, to develop measures of these individual differences and then correlate them with other indices of psychological functioning. Thus, the gender role conflict scale, the male role norm scale, and the masculine gender role stress scale have been very commonly used tools for assessing correlations between masculinity and other variables. Now, at the risk of being overly controversial, and remember this is Michael Addis talking, not me personally, this is where the field is stuck, looking at correlations between self-report measures of masculinity and other indices of psychological or physical functioning. We can say again and again, look, masculinity is correlated with depression, masculinity is related to aggression, masculinity is related to negative attitudes toward help-seeking, masculinity is related to, and the list goes on. This is all important knowledge, and I certainly don't mean to disparage the work that led to these discoveries. We would not be here discussing these issues without it. The question is it enough, and where should we go from here? My answer is that it's not enough, and that where we need to go is into psychology, developmental psychology, social psychology, psychobiology, narrative psychology. In short, without better integrating the psychology of men and masculinity into psychology more broadly, the field is at risk of atrophying. On the other hand, if we begin to integrate basic research in psychology into our own work, there are several positive consequences that can follow. For example, first, researchers and clinicians in other fields will become aware of our work. Second, the membership of Division 51 can grow in numbers and in vitality. Third, our work may begin to have an impact more broadly. And fourth, we may begin to answer questions that are currently out of reach. Why is masculinity associated with depression? Is there really such a thing as masked depression? How can we explain within-person variability in emotional expression? The papers you'll hear today describe initial attempts to integrate basic research in psychology into an understanding of men's mental health. MySha and Jason begin by describing the relevance of two contemporary models of emotion to understanding emotional expression in men. Their work is theoretical, but has significant implications for empirical and clinical work. As you listen to their talk, bear in mind that the overwhelming majority of work on men, masculinity, and emotion over the last 2 decades has proceeded in isolation from advances in the study of emotion more broadly. Make no mistake, how we understand emotions themselves has a significant impact on how we understand emotions in men. Matt and John present 2 ongoing studies on depression in men. Matt begins by describing preliminary results from a study of recently unemployed men at risk for depression. His work is guided both by recent research on conformity to masculine norms and also by a cognitive diathesis stress model of depression that has proven very fruitful in basic psychopathology research. John Green will describe the start of what is, in my opinion, the most ambitious study of masked depression in men yet. John uses established psychophysiological measurement paradigms to see whether one of the key assumptions underlying the theory of masked depression bears out in an empirical test. Is it in fact true that more masculine men respond more phobically at a physiological level to soft emotions such as sadness? Let me close by saying, again, this is Michael speaking, that I am sorry I can't be with you at this year's conference. I was looking forward to spending time with many of the members of Division 51. I was also greatly looking forward to this symposium. I'm very excited by the research you're going to hear. Let's begin at this time with MySha Whorley.
Okay, I want to thank Alisha for that wonderful, Michael and Alisha for that wonderful introduction. And as she mentioned, we're going to, Jason and I are going to be talking about basic emotion research as a framework for understanding emotional non-expression in men. So as we now approach the 8th year of publication for the Psychology of Men and Masculinity, it's become clear that there's quite a bit of interest in masculinity and men's experience and expression of emotion. Much of this research has shown that men are less likely than women to display a range of affect, and that men are socialized to adhere to norms of emotional control, competitiveness, self-reliance, and dominance, adherence which precludes the expression of many of the more vulnerable emotions. Explanations of this non-expression have often taken 2 forms. One is that men experience the same emotions that women do, but lack of socialization about emotions leaves them without the ability to differentiate or label these emotions. Or the second common explanation is that men, once they experience a soft or vulnerable emotion, immediately feel threatened and channel that emotion into a hard emotion, one that's more acceptable, such as anger. What becomes clear through both of these explanations is that largely the field of masculinity research has been operating from an implicit assumption that emotion is an internal object or state that gender affects the expression of. In other words, if you look at the slide that's up now, the dominant view assumes that masculinity is present as a relatively stable trait within men, and that emotions are present as discrete objects. So if you see up on the screen, there are three discrete balls or objects inside of the man. The presence of masculinity then somehow impedes the expression or release of these internal objects. For instance, imagine a man who's out playing golf with friends and receives a phone call that his son has just been in a car accident. He continues to play several more holes of golf without mentioning the accident to his friends. From the dominant view of man and emotion, one might assume that he felt some general negative feeling, but was unsure of which emotion he was feeling. Some might say he was experiencing fear, but his lack of ability to pick out fear among the several discrete emotions inside himself prevented him from expressing it. Others might say that he did not want to appear weak in front of his friends or to have them take pity on him for the rest of the round, and in this case he may have felt threatened by the emotion and so suppressed its expression. The problem with this view is that it doesn't explain why different men adhering to the same norms under similar and different circumstances may express those emotions, may or may not express those emotions. So our approach to the study of emotions in men to date sort of lacks the complexity to help us understand the conditions under which different men or the same man would or would not express various emotions. Luckily for us, emotion researchers have been studying such phenomena as emotion recognition, identification, repression, and suppression, and emotional non-expression for decades, and have contributed immensely to our understanding of the development and function of the human emotional response. This research, if integrated, has the potential to transform what we can understand about men and emotion through a more nuanced understanding of the experience and expression of emotion itself. In a seminal article published in 2005, Wong and Rockland took a significant step in this direction of integrating basic emotion research, when they used the cognitive evaluative model of emotional expression and non-expression developed by Kennedy, Moore, and Watson to understand restrictive emotionality in men. They investigated the relationship between men's restrictive emotionality, a concept developed by masculinity researchers, and other emotion-related constructs, such as difficulty identifying feelings and negative attitudes towards emotional expression. In doing so, these authors began to expand their thinking about gender and emotional expression to include the basic science of emotion. The authors concluded with a caution against one-size-fits-all approaches to the study of emotion in men. In this vein, what we intend to do today is present to you two current models of emotional experience and expression posed by researchers Feldman Barrett and Kennedy, Moore, and Watson in an attempt to reconceptualize men's purported lack of emotional expression through the lens of a basic emotion research. We will briefly describe each model and examine the basic assumptions and then think through how our research questions and interventions with regard to men and emotion might differ when working within the model. So Jason's going to start.
Hello, right now today do not intend to summarize the entirety of Lisa Feldman Barrett's model of emotionality, but what I will do is introduce its basic tenets and its features in order to explore the expression of emotion in men from a new angle. The goal of this presentation is therefore threefold. First, I will challenge the way that most of us understand what an emotion is. Next, I will offer a new way of conceptualizing emotion, and I will then discuss how that new conceptualization will affect how we conceptualize masculinity and emotion. Most psychologists conceptualize emotion through what Lisa Feldman Barrett calls the natural kind view. Essentially, in the natural kind view, emotions are seen as discrete states with discrete boundaries in nature. Like here on the screen here, we have sadness, anger, joy, and fear. They all have some overlap, but as in this picture, there are discrete boundaries between each one. The actual model of the natural kind view looks like this. We start with an event, which will then trigger an emotion. That emotion will then, at the same time, trigger a feeling, a facial expression, vocal change, peripheral nervous system reaction, and voluntary action as well. This is also congruous to the model most researchers in the field of men and masculinity use for emotion. The hegemonic view of masculinity research is that an emotion such as fear or sadness is a natural object somewhere within a man. When a man experiences fear, for example, the masculinity blocks the expression of the fear lingering within. Masculinity will then do one of two things. It will either change the expression of the emotion into that of a more acceptable emotion, a hard emotion such as anger, or it could even prevent the expression of the emotion at all. Thus, according to the hegemonic view, highly masculine men feel a whole range of emotions, including soft emotions like fear or sadness, as well as the hard emotions, but masculinity will then step in the way, stunting the experience of those emotions. Through meta-analysis, though, Feldman Barrett found that the theory of discrete emotions did not hold up in the psychological research. She first proposed that this is because emotions might not in fact be discrete entities, and that they are instead categorical experiences unique to each person and context. The experience of emotions such as fear, sadness, or happiness is based on the interaction of two things: core affect and conceptual knowledge. Core affect is defined as the body's natural barometer of whether the current environment is beneficial or harmful to the individual. It can be thought of as a continuum of positive versus negative affect, with a lot of continuing things. You can be very upset to very positive feeling, and a lot in between. Conceptual knowledge is seen as the knowledge of emotions instilled by culture and past experience. In other words, it can include what emotions feel like, the associated behaviors, and the appropriate context for the emotions. As an example, we will look at how Michael feels sadness through the Feldman-Barrett model. First, Mike's wife yells at him. The next thing happens is he experiences some negative affect. He will then test that affective state and the context it happened in against his conceptual knowledge of emotions. His negative affect and his wife's harsh tone best fit his conceptual knowledge for the feeling of sadness. He then categorizes his feelings as sadness and will thus feel sad, display the behaviors that he has paired with sadness in his conceptual knowledge. And to help understand how conceptual knowledge can actually work to categorize a continuum such as affect, I will demonstrate another mental process that we all go through that works much the same way. This circle right here has a wavelength of 450 nanometers. Many of you are primarily English speakers, and therefore I would assume most of you would categorize this circle as blue. That main reason why we do this is because English distinguishes between blue and green. But if you were a Berimo speaker from Papua New Guinea, you would experience this circle as green, as they only distinguish between the colors green and brown. They have no concept of the color blue. And if you spoke Turkish as your primary language, you would probably experience this color as lasiver, which translates roughly to dark blue, which is actually a separate category from their word for blue. So these three differences in the experience of the same wavelength of light are all based on conceptual knowledge, not based on any difference in your internal structures inside. How then does this new outlook affect how we conceptualize the problem of men and masculinity and with emotion? Recall my example of how Mike experienced sadness. Well, there's another guy here, Russ. Not all guys experience sadness when it's a negative situation. Some men experience harder emotions much more often. In the case of Russ, when his wife yelled at him, he expressed anger. According to the hegemonic view, Russ actually did experience sadness at first, but then the masculinity caused a fear or aversion to this sadness, and he then in turn expressed his internal sadness as anger, as it's more acceptable to his masculine norms. Well, when you look at it through the Feldman-Barrett model, Russ's actions kind of take a different shape. Basically, first, his wife yelled at him, then he felt the negative affect, just like Mike. But when Russ tested his affective state and conceptual knowledge against context accepting conceptual knowledge, he included his masculinity norms as part of his conceptual knowledge. He then, in turn, categorized his negative affect as anger. The reason why I chose anger is because through his masculinity norms, hard emotions are much more acceptable in a lot more situations. He then felt angry and displayed behaviors as conceptual knowledge had paired with anger. Therefore, Russ never actually had a feeling of sadness to be repressed. He only felt angry, and his conceptual knowledge favored anger, which was a hard emotion, in that particular situation. So the big picture that we want to take from this is that an emotion is not a physical entity within a man. It's actually an experience that he has. And that masculinity should not be thought of as something that manipulates the expression of a pre-existing discrete emotion, but instead as a mechanism that affects the creation of an emotional experience. Now, if this is all true, how does that affect future research and clinical practice? First, there's already a vast body of research demonstrating masculinity's relationship to the emotional expression. This model provides an alternative explanation to this data, which may help us to explain and understand the findings in a new way. Also, this model opens up the opportunity for researchers to test the mechanisms and to figure out exactly how masculinity can affect the experience of emotion. We can then use masculinity as a lens which to test the Feldman-Barrett model, which at this time is still mostly theoretical. Also, in the realm of therapy as well as research, one of the most important notions of the Feldman-Barrett model is that there is no underlying sadness, fear, or other soft emotions behind anger or even a lack of emotion expressed by highly masculine men. Often therapists will spend weeks or months trying to uncover some kind of deep-seated soft emotion behind anger expressed by their highly masculine clients. This task, though, when viewed through the Feldman-Barrett model, is actually futile. This is because any progress in uncovering these deep-seated emotions could also be explained as a therapist inadvertently changing the conceptual knowledge of their client as opposed to actually finding something that was in there. The best way to deal with this would then be to attack the problem at its source and work with the client to actually re-educate him on his conceptual knowledge of emotions, trying to expand the softer emotions and make him realize that there are more contexts where they are acceptable. Now, this presentation has by far not been a complete description of Lisa Feldman-Barrett's model. If you are interested in her exact theory of emotion and all of her evidence as to why the natural kind model doesn't really hold up, you can check these two articles, Are Emotions Natural Kinds, and also Solving the Emotion Paradox. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the cognitive evaluative model of emotion that was developed by Kennedy, Moore, Greenberg, and Wortman, and later developed by Kennedy, Moore, and Watson, to explain how underlying or covert emotional processes are translated from physiological sensations into overt emotional expression. These researchers emphasize a multifaceted view of emotional expression that takes both individual and contextual social factors into account. On the screen, you can see a visual depiction of the cognitive evaluative model of emotional expression. This is a 5-step model that's driven by affective experience, and at each subsequent step in the model, there's an increase in the amount of influence that cognition plays over the expression of emotion. In other words, in the first step, a man simply experiences the physiological changes or the bodily signals of a difficult emotion without necessarily even noticing that he's distressed. Whereas by step 5, he not only notices the bodily signals, but has interpreted what they might mean, whether they're congruent with his values, and whether the context is appropriate for disclosing those feelings. Kennedy, Moore, and Watson explained that this model can be applied to the expression of both positive and negative emotions, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus primarily on those emotions that are distressing. So let me first present an example, and then I'll use that example to walk us through the 5 steps of the model and how disruption at each step may lead to non-expression of emotion. Scott is a 47-year-old senior manager at an internet technology company. His wife has recently been diagnosed with a serious illness and needs to undergo treatment that would require significant lifestyle changes for Scott's family. Let's explore what factors in each step of this model might influence Scott's expression or non-expression of emotion. So step 1 of the cognitive evaluative model of emotional expression is pre-reflective reaction. This is where one first experiences the physiological changes associated with emotion. So, for instance, when Scott first hears the news of his wife's diagnosis, before he has a chance to think things through, his body begins immediately to send off signals that something important is happening. One potential explanation for non-expression of emotion is a disruption at this stage of the model, whereby one experiences little or no pre-reflective reaction. So it may be that Scott is low in affect intensity, so he really doesn't feel that there's anything that needs to be expressed. Step 2 is conscious perception of response. Here, Scott first recognizes that his body is sending him signals that he's distressed. Non-expression at this stage takes the form of a more motivated blocking of awareness of the distress. So if Scott finds the experience of his distress too threatening, he may repress it or deny that it's having any impact on him. Step 3 is labeling or interpreting of the response. It's here where Scott must draw on internal and external situational cues to determine what the physiological sensations he's having actually mean. So non-expression at this level typically takes the form of alexithymia, or an inability to label or interpret his experience. Scott may not know how to differentiate between different kinds of bad feelings and only knows that he feels bad in some way. And what this does is it makes it more difficult for him to benefit from expressing his feelings because he doesn't know exactly what kind of help to ask for. He doesn't know if he's feeling angry, sad, hurt, disappointed. And masculinity researchers have actually recognized men's difficulty at this level of non-expression. In fact, Dr. Ron Levant has even developed the concept of normative male alexithymia, which is a mild inability to recognize and label emotions that seems to be widespread among men. And he's begun measurement research on this construct, so there's some promise in expression at this level. Step 4 is where Scott would evaluate his response as acceptable or unacceptable. Here, Scott compares what he's feeling with his beliefs about what is important or desirable or acceptable under the circumstances. And this is one spot where masculinity norms might also factor into non-expression. If Scott believes strongly that emotional control and independently handling his distress are important in situations like this, he's likely to interpret his distress as unacceptable and is much less likely then to express that distress to anyone else. Step 5 is the point where one evaluates the match between their current context and their emotional experience to determine whether it's appropriate to disclose their emotions. For instance, if Scott were at the hospital with his wife's mother and the hospital counselor, he might find it easier or more appropriate for him to tell them how he's feeling than if he were out at happy hour with coworkers after he heard the diagnosis. It's also at this step where masculine norms might play a role in helping men to determine what context provides safe opportunities for self-disclosure. So now that we've taken a closer look at the model, let's briefly examine the main ideas behind it, because the basic assumptions of the cognitive evaluative model that I've just described differ in several ways from those of the prevailing view of emotional non-expression in men. So first, the prevailing view of non-expression in men takes for granted that this non-expression is almost always maladaptive. The assumption seems to be that masculine norms prevent men from disclosing their distress, which then prevents men not only from getting help for that distress, but also from alleviating their suffering through sharing. Conversely, the assumption of the cognitive evaluative model is that non-expression has both adaptive and maladaptive features, depending on the motivation behind it, the social context, and characteristics of the individual man. For instance, if Scott were at work with an important client when he got the news of his wife's illness, it would not only be appropriate but adaptive for Scott not to share his emotions. Only if Scott continued not to share in supportive contexts would this non-expression be considered maladaptive. Current research questions and interventions often propose educating men about the ills of masculine gender socialization, encouraging men to express distress to close others, and exploring the potential negative correlates of non-expression of emotion. This research rarely takes into account the potential adaptiveness of non-expression and the importance of context in decisions to express or not. When working from the cognitive evaluative model, research might instead be aimed at understanding and enhancing the adaptive qualities of non-expression, examining the context in which men do or do not feel comfortable, exploring the beliefs behind those feelings, and also exploring other social psychological factors that might affect emotional expression. So it doesn't always all come down to masculine norms. Second, the dominant view of emotion in men has yet to articulate the multidimensionality of emotional experience. Instead, emotions are viewed as distinct entities, and a linear relationship seems to be positive, with masculine norms directly prohibiting the expression, emergence of emotion objects. According to the cognitive evaluative model, however, there are 4 components to emotion: arousal, experience, reflection, and expression. Masculine norms can come into play in any one of these domains, from reducing affect intensity to reducing a particular man's ability to recognize or label emotions, to increasing men's sensitivity to the context in which it's appropriate to disclose. Instead of asking research questions concerning the relationship between masculine norms and non-expression of emotion at a social level, this model might instead lead us to ask questions about the nature of emotional experience itself. We might think more conceptually about the role of cognition in the expression of emotion and the fluctuating ambivalence men often have about the utility of expressing distress. We might also target interventions at increasing men's awareness and understanding of the different emotion components for its own sake, without necessarily encouraging them to express their distress to other people. Third, empirical research on masculinity and emotion in men has largely overlooked the individual in the experience of emotion and emotional expression. Men's non-expression of emotion is widely believed to be a universal phenomenon, with most men operating under the influence of masculine norm pressure. The model we've just described, however, incorporates the individual variability inherent in psychological processes. The cognitive evaluative model allows for variability in the initial physiological reactions to a stressor, with some people experiencing very low affect and others experiencing great physiological arousal to even minor life circumstances. Individual differences are also outlined in the level of motivation one has to block or deny the impact of a stressor, the ability one has to differentiate and label emotions, beliefs one has about the appropriateness of specific reactions to specific stressors, and sensitivities to context. Through the lens of this model, interventions might be aimed at any one of those levels, exploring in a more nuanced way what might create continuity or discrepancy between one's experience at different levels of the emotion process. So to sum up, in order to more fully understand expression and non-expression of emotion in men, and to encourage adaptive ways of using and communicating distressing feelings, we have to integrate the abundance of basic emotion research that has been conducted on such topics. It's important to understand that both emotions and the context in which they emerge are multidimensional, and the more we can open our perspective to that complexity, the more we'll be able to target interventions at increasing the healthy and adaptive functions of emotions in men. Thank you.
How do I get that presentation up? Right here. There we go. Okay, good afternoon. So you can hear me there. My name is Matthew Syzdek, and Jonathan Green and I are going to be discussing integrating basic psychopathology models and methods into the study of depression in men. So our outline is rather simple today. We're going to discuss where we have gone, where we're going, or where we might go, and then give you two examples of how that might look. So I'm going to briefly start by describing what are some of the primary contributions from the psychology of men and masculinity. So as I think people have read in the literature, it's been widely cited that negative consequences to gender role socialization, often described as gender role conflict, gender role strain, and various other constructs, have been correlated with depression and negative attitudes towards help-seeking. This has been seen in a variety of populations, clinical samples, college students, older men, younger men, et cetera, et cetera. They've also learned a lot from some of the clinicians in the division that have looked at the constellation of depressive symptoms they're seeing in their clients. They're finding differences between men and women, and particularly that men are tending to display irritability, withdrawal, and externalizing behaviors. In addition, we've learned a lot from researchers and clinicians about how we might address masculinity in the context of psychotherapy, looking at various different modalities and different psychotherapy orientations. Now, I believe this has come, and a lot of this work has stemmed from two primary assumptions that I think are linked. The first is that PMM has discarded much of the psychological models of depression as they have not described the clinical experience of clinicians. We agree that the basic psychopathology literature has not examined gender beyond a trait or beyond differences between men and women. However, though, we do argue that tossing out these models aside both alienates us from the larger research community and really leaves us reinventing the wheel. There's been decades of research, so we should perhaps, look at that. That's what I guess that assumption might say. Finally, we all here are interested in gender. That's a given. However, gender may not always be the best means for studying depression. We'll present two examples of other models of depression that are not based on gender, but we believe are amenable to the integration of gender into that model. And we believe that much of PMM, much of the research from the psychology of men and masculinity stems from these assumptions. And so now we're going to present to you some areas of growth that we believe we could look at. The first is integrating basic psychopathology models. In the past 40 years, psychologists have built and evaluated theoretical models of depression that address both its etiology and maintenance. Extensive empirical findings from basic work in psychopathology have been largely overlooked by the psychology of men and masculinity. One considerable weakness, as I noted earlier in these theories, is that their understanding of gender is something that either women have or a sex difference. So this is a gaping hole in the psychology literature that we believe the psychology of men and masculinity can make a significant contribution. Cochran and Rabinowitz called for this and recognized this, and in their book where they discussed cognitive, behavioral, and psychodynamic theories and how they might be useful in conceptualizing depression in men. So we're hoping to continue that trend. Also, the second point there is identifying mediators and moderators. What we're discussing for that is that really will help us understand the how. So how does masculinity contribute to depression? What's the process going on there? And this was called for by Hepner, and I think a great example is Good and colleagues in 2004 looked at problem-solving appraisal and how that perhaps mediated the relationship between gender role conflict and psychological distress. And interestingly, some of their findings contradicted many of the core sort of assumptions of the work that we're doing. So we believe that is, again, a trend that we would like to continue because it might be very fruitful. In addition, the literature has widely shown that there's a lack of community samples and longitudinal designs in some of this research, so those are also areas of growth. So I'm going to begin by discussing the cognitive diathesis stress model. And as in any diathesis stress model, it's theorized that depression occurs in a situation where a person has both a stressor, in this case a negative life event, and some type of diathesis. And in this case, we're looking at a cognitive vulnerability. So really, a cognitive vulnerability, one common one that has been researched in the literature over the past years has been explanatory style. And that is the idea that how people think about what happens to them, negative life events and such things, how they think about it might contribute to depression. So in short, depression is theorized to occur when a cognitive vulnerability, most commonly pessimistic explanatory style or dysfunctional attitudes, as in Beck's model, interact with a stressful life event to cause hopelessness and depression. So I'm going to take a moment here and explain a little bit more about what pessimistic explanations are and how they may relate to depression. So explanatory style describes how people view the causes to negative life events. It's related to attributional style. In the study of depression, causes that are viewed as stable and global have been consistently shown to be associated with the onset and maintenance of depression. So a stable attribution, a thought that the person might have is, this is going to keep happening to me. A global attribution might be, this is going to affect my work, social life, and family. I think, in a sense, what the stable and global is really getting at is, do you view this event, this negative life event, as something that is uncontrollable? And like I said, research has shown that when people attribute these causes to negative life, research has shown that when people attribute the causes of negative life events to stable and global causes, they tend to become hopeless and depressed. Now, on the other hand, if they tend to view these events as unstable, meaning that it's likely not to continue, the cause is unstable, and that the effects are not global, that they're specific, it can be a protective factor in preventing depression. So I'm going to tell you a little story here. Here's Jim. He lays sheetrock in a local contractor, a medium-sized contractor. He's been working there for the past 5 to 6 years. The other day, he received a notice of termination. He got his pink slip. There's been a downturn in business, and they need to cut costs. Here are some thoughts that Jim has. First thought being the cause. My boss had it out for me. The second thought being, I can't change my boss, it'll always be like this. He's thinking stable. And also, people in general have it out for me. They'll ruin my entire life. So those are examples of stable and global. So eventually he'll become hopeless and depressed because he has a cognitive vulnerability for depression, at least in this story. Now, on the other hand, if he had thought, well, my boss had it out for me, but I'll find a new job and a better boss, well, that would then be, he would be less vulnerable to depression because he wouldn't be viewing these life events as uncontrollable. So now I'm going to illustrate the cognitive diathesis stress model with a recent study that is currently in progress, and we feel really helpful in describing how we might apply this theory to actual research. So we surveyed 62 men at a local unemployment office. All these men were recently unemployed. They were primarily from working and middle-class backgrounds from various ethnicities. We used a longitudinal design. Today I'm going to present some of our cross-sectional results from our initial data collection, which was, from our initial data collection. And then we're going to show you, we're going to explain this model here. So here's the model that we are testing right now, that we're investigating. And the question that we're trying to answer is, how does men's adherence to hegemonic masculinity relate to cognitive vulnerabilities to depression following a negative life event? So we hypothesized that negative explanatory style and cognitive coping style would mediate the relationship between adherence to masculine norms and depression. So you may be thinking here, so what do masculine norms or masculinity have to do with thinking about negative life events? Well, we're going to explain how they might be related. So here on the left are a bunch of thoughts that may define a man's self-concept. As you can see, they're all related to hegemonic masculine norms. He's in control, he's successful, he can handle things on his own, self-reliant, he's a good worker, he's a primacy of work there. Ladies love me, he's got some playboy in there. I'm in charge of everything, he likes to be dominant. So those are some thoughts or ways that this individual might view his sort of self-concept or view himself. Well, then an incongruent life event happens. He loses his job. He may be divorced. He may experience some type of failure. So now, whoops, jumped the gun there. Okay. So once this negative life event occurs, he must make sense of this job loss, divorce, failure, whatever it might be. And we believe that masculine norms may constrain his thinking about these negative life events. Our research and theory about gender has at least suggests that masculinity is a restrictive construct that constrains how men think about things. So we believe that it should affect their explanations that they give in negative life events. So a man is likely to make explanations that are congruent with his self-concept, one that is based on his hegemonic masculine norms. In order to reduce the cognitive dissonance between his self-concept and this life event, he may explain the event as something that is out of his control, because it's not his fault. It has to be out of his control. Then this reduces the shame that he may feel for not living up to hegemonic masculine norms. Well, this type of thinking is effective at reducing shame and cognitive dissonance. It may send him down a trajectory towards depression, because in a sense, he's developing a negative explanatory style. Okay, we are really low on time here. So I'll briefly describe to you some of the results that we found. Here's a diagram showing what we found so far at our time on data. We looked at self-reliance, which is a masculine norm. It means, in a sense, how much do you like to handle problems on your own. We also looked at explanatory style, which is what I mentioned earlier. Specifically, we looked at explanatory style, so or job explanatory style. How do men view the causes to their job loss and current unemployment? And we also looked at depression as measured by the BDI-2. And what we found were some pretty striking correlations that are in line with our hypotheses, showing that self-reliance is correlated with depression. That replicates prior research. But also self-reliance is related to a negative explanatory style. So this supports the hypothesis that self-reliance may restrict or constrain how men think about negative life events. And in turn, explanatory style was related to depression. Now this specific model did not support mediation, but we believe we'll be able to give a more robust statistical test once we have our time 2 data collected, which is we're finishing up right now. In addition, I'm going to throw in something here a little bit extra that I haven't really mentioned yet. Here's another example of a cognitive process and how it could be used to understand masculinity and its contributions to depression. We examined the relationship among positive reappraisal as a cognitive coping style, masculine norms, and depression. So positive reappraisal describes the extent that the person tries to think about negative events or situations in a more positive way. Essentially, how much can they see the good and the bad? Or when they tend to think about a situation, when they reappraise, do they see it in a more positive light? So we found that positive reappraisal mediates the relationship between the masculine norm of self-reliance and depression. In addition, emotional control had a strong negative correlation with positive reappraisal, meaning men that keep emotions on the inside and don't like expressing emotions tend to less often reappraise situations more positively. And in turn, positive reappraisal was negatively correlated with depression. Positive reappraisal did not mediate the relationship between emotional control and depression, though. In sum, I think what these results show is that the utility of investigating depression in men through the lens of a cognitive diathesis stress model. By integrating gender into this extant model, we can better understand both masculinity and its contributions to depression. So now I'm going to transition to John, and he's going to discuss another phenomenon of great interest in psychology of masculinity, and also what basic psychopathology research may be able to elucidate.
Thank you, Matt. So just quickly, Matt mentioned his guy Jim that lost his job. And so Matt talked about the cognitions, the thoughts that guy was having, what was going on. I'm more interested in the emotions surrounding that experience and what that guy does with them. And I think that this will help us understand why some guys look different when they're depressed. There's been this discussion of a masked depression, a masculine depression, a men's depression. And so I think that looking at what guys do with emotions will help us to better understand why these guys look different when they're depressed. So the first and biggest question is, does this masked depression exist? And if so, how do we study a masked depression at its nature? It's masked, it's hidden. How do we get at it? A good place to start would be the response styles theory of depression. It's a well-established model of depression, and it claims, or it states rather, that women are more likely to ruminate with their symptoms and their depressive problems. And as a result are, number one, more likely to become depressed, and number two, are more likely to have longer bouts of depression, whereas men are more likely to distract from these depressive symptoms, engage in externalizing behaviors. That can be anything from going out and drinking with their buddies, abusing alcohol, abusing drugs, or more healthy things like working out, going to the gym, playing sports. So starting with that, this is the model that we kind of think goes on with guys that do experience a masked or masculine depression. When they do come in contact with these depressive stimuli, they first experience a phobic response. They experience these emotions and feel uncomfortable with them, try to push them away, and literally do experience a phobic or fearful response, which I'll get into later. Later, that's when we see more of the response styles theory with the distraction. And this distraction looks like the externalizing behaviors and occasionally anger. And this leads to the constellation of symptoms that we've labeled a masked or masculine depression, not necessarily a true masked depression, as we've also heard it conceptualized. So looking at this right now in a study, I do need to lead off with, I don't have the results of the study yet, it's ongoing, but I will present my theories and hypothesis behind what I've seen so far. I build it as the men in movies study, so that guys didn't know it was about depression or mass depression. That would tend to confound it. We're looking to get about 50 men. I'm on participant number 43 as of last week. And we have them watching the movie clip from The End of Ordinary People. Just to describe the clip a little bit, there's a young boy who's been dealing with the death of his brother. It's a very emotional, intense scene at the end because he's talking with his therapist, reliving the death of his brother, which he witnessed in a boating accident. There's a lot of vulnerability, a lot of emotional intimacy. So those are things that guys shouldn't be showing in front of each other. Those kind of break our masculine norms. And also in contrast, the characters show a lot of anger. So we are able to compare those two different things. The real linchpin of the study is that we're using physiological measurements to understand what's going on with these guys. So the three very basic measurements we're using are heart rate, which is determined by EKG, galvanic skin response, or GSR, that's just how sweaty your fingertips are, and skin temperature, which is also measured at the fingertips. So we expect to see different responses from different types of guys. We always talk about high and low masculine guys. In the case of this study, that's determined by the CMNI and the GRCS. So the low masculine guy, if he runs into particularly depressive stimuli in the movie, we would expect to see a fairly typical SAD response. As you can see, this is just a screenshot of the program that we use to determine what's going on with these guys physiologically. Top line is their heart rate is determined by EKG. Second line is the GSR, that's again the fingertips, how sweaty they are. Third line is the skin temperature, and the last line is the heart rate. So what we expect to see in the SAD response is a relatively flat and unmoving GSR. That's the second line down. That doesn't really have a lot of activity going on. And also the skin temperature is relatively neutral. We do notice the most distinct part of a SAD response is the slight increase in heart rate, which you see at the very end. This entire clip, I'm not sure if you can see at the bottom, but it does occur over the course of about 8 seconds. Now in contrast to that, what we would see with a high masculine guy is a phobic response. The things that you noticed almost instantaneously is that the GSR, the second line, does rise dramatically while skin temperature falls very rapidly. This is the only response where we do see a drop in skin temperature, so that's kind of the smoking gun for us. Also, it's very important to note is that in the last 2 seconds of what you see on the screen, the heart rate does rise about 13 beats per minute. Again, that's also very apparent. So what does all of this mean when we put it all together in terms of this study? It means that we would think that high masculine guys would tend to exhibit a phobic response and distract from depressive stimuli. So that's what's going on in the moment when these guys are dealing with these symptoms, with these depressive stimuli. The more important part of this is that over time, if they continue to distract from this and continue to show these externalizing behaviors, we might start to call that a masked or masculine depression, as opposed to a prototypical DSM diagnosed major depressive disorder. So just final thoughts, just summing up Matt's and my entire talk. It's important for us to integrate these basic psychopathology theories into the work of men and masculinity. As Michael / Alisha mentioned in his / her opening remarks, the psych of men and masculinity has evolved more or less independent of major emotion work in psychology. Also, it's important to think about how men construct these negative life events and how they respond to this negative affect. It does give us a better understanding of what's going on with them. And of course, doing all these things helps increase our knowledge of depression and gender role socialization.
Thank you for coming. There's no time for questions.
We'll be outside if you have
Yeah,
questions.
yeah.
Thanks for coming.